Hey everybody, it's Robert, and I'm with Mr. Dan Aiken, and we are in the Waverly Hall Cemetery. And this cemetery started out as a church graveyard. And so when was the church built?
The Mount Zion Methodist Church was formed in 1827. Just as soon as the settlers got here, they started the church. And it was later built here on this site, I believe in 1830-31, somewhere along in there. But the church stood right here, and the church cemetery was on the hill back up there behind the church. And this little driveway that you see right here was the driveway that went along beside the building up to the cemetery. The rest of this was just woods. The church stood here from the early 1830s, I'd say 1830 or 31, until around 1923 was when it was torn down. But the church itself, the congregation used the building from the time it was built until the railroad came through Waverly Hall. And when the railroad came through in 1886 and 87, later, and I believe in 1896, the congregation built a new church in town. And this one was left vacant. And it stood vacant, and they used it on occasions. It was used as a schoolhouse for a while. And then it was used on, different Sundays. They would come out here and have programs, and then I understand that it was used for funerals. They continued to use it for that. And there were a few holdout families. There were folks out in Talbot County that would not go into Waverly Hall to church. They said this is where they had always been members, and they continued to come here. So the preacher would still come out here and hold services. But the last preacher that served this church was Reverend J.J. Ansley. And he was pastor of Waverly Hall Methodist Church at the time this building was torn down. And this building was torn down, and the lumber was used to build the Sunday school rooms on the back of the old church. And those rooms still exist today on the back of that building, which is now the Masonic Lodge, because a new church was built later in 1948 just across the street. But it was Mr. Reverend Ansley's desire that upon his death, he wanted to be buried where the pulpit had been at the church. He had actually served this church in his young days. He was born and raised in what's now Pine Mountain Valley. And he used to come to this church as a young man. And later, when he became a minister, he served this church briefly, and he had good memories of it. And he served it in its very final days. And he knew what a strong church it had been over the years. And he wanted his final resting place to be underneath where the pulpit had stood. So it's in the church minutes in Waverly Hall that this is, I believe it was worded that he's buried almost squarely beneath the location of the pulpit. And then later in 1966, his wife passed away, and she was brought here and buried. Her name was Clifford Ansley. So the pulpit was here. The church congregation was out here, and I understand that it was one of the old Methodist churches that had a short divider down the middle. The men sat on one side and the women on the other. Male and females were separated. There were two front doors for males to enter, and then the two back doors back here on either side of the pulpit to exit. And males and females would enter separate doors and exit separate doors. But I've heard a lot of stories about the church, but one that sticks out in my memory is Mr. William Marshall told me that when old Mrs. Rosalius Walton was buried on the far side of the hill, they brought her here in a horse-drawn hearse. And he said as they came up beside the church, a big swarm of honeybees came out of the side of the church building and got on the horse. And the horse ran away and just tore the hearse all to pieces.
Oh, wow.
With poor old Miss Walton in the back of it in a casket, and the hearse turned over after it went over that hill.
That's funny. I have seen several abandoned churches with honeybees on the side of it. It's funny that he said that.
Honeybees love old churches.
They do.
They love abandoned buildings.
But that's really cool. So that is an idea of where the church stood, and I guess it faced the road.
It did. It faced the old Alabama road. That's the old federal road from it came down from Watkinsville all the way across diagonally, going from northeast Georgia to southwest. It crossed the Chattahoochee River in what's now Columbus. That was Kennard's Ferry then. And it crossed there and it went all the way through the Indian Territory to the old state line of Alabama. And that's why it's called the Old Alabama Road. The Old Alabama Road that's now out here now, that's called the Old Alabama Road, right outside of Waverly Hall, is not the Old Alabama Road. At some point the sign got turned sideways and the name just kind of stuck.
Right.
But the sign originally was for Highway 36, which goes all the way across the state of Georgia, and it's known as the Old Alabama Road from one side of Georgia all the way to the other, except in Waverly Hall. And we've got one little stretch of road out here that's been misnamed. But anyway, the church faced that road. The big magnolia was on one side and a big oak tree was on the other side. And of course the oak tree died long ago, but the magnolia.
I was going to ask, is that magnolia still?
Magnolias are almost immortal.
Yeah.
And that magnolia, if I had to guess, I'd say that magnolia is probably 175 years old.
Let's go take a look at it. Get it on video. I actually walked under it just a moment ago, and I said I thought that was a really cool looking magnolia tree with all the limbs coming down, but didn't know it was that old. So all of this where the graves are now is where the church would have been. And when did the city acquire the cemetery, since it started as a church graveyard?
The cemetery fell into terrible disrepair sometime in the 1940s. And by the mid-1950s, it had become a community cemetery instead of just a church cemetery for church members only. The whole community was using it. So it is outside the city limits, and the Methodist Church gave it to the city of Waverly Hall. And it was agreed that the town of Waverly Hall would keep up the cemetery, and of course they were free at that point to sell burial spaces here. So when you bought a space here, you were actually buying burial rights, and spaces here were sold up until maybe 10 years or so ago, when spaces finally ran out. There's no other room here. It's bordered on all three sides back there by a neighborhood, a subdivision, and an old subdivision. So the town supposedly is supposed to continue to keep it up, but it's not looking good right now. It could be better. It has been kept very well in years past, but right now it's sadly kind of neglected. I don't think any time in my life I've ever seen the magnolia leaves this deep around this tree. But that is an old tree. Robert, I believe you could climb all the way to the top of that tree.
I think so.
I'll give it a try.
Not today. Not today, but you could easily too.
Very easy.
That's pretty cool. It's a big old tree. I had no idea it was that old, you know?
Yeah.
It's, I guess, a witness tree.
I guess so.
Seen some things.
It is.
So we've been here a couple times, I think in the past, we looked at the Whitehead graves here, if I'm not mistaken, before.
Yeah.
And this is the older part of the cemetery right here, correct? This is where it would have started for the church?
That's right. And the oldest marked grave in the cemetery is this one. Now, I'm sure there's other graves that are probably older than this one, but this is the earliest marked one. And this is the grave of Reverend Thomas Darley. And Reverend Darley was a missionary preacher in the Methodist Church back in the early days of Methodism. He has got a long and illustrious history to his background. Anyone so inclined that wants to read all about him, all they got to do is Google Reverend Thomas Darley, and there's a lot comes up about him online on the internet. Brother Darley was, he moved here right after this part of the country was opened up to the settlers, and he bought a home here, and I believe it was probably the first and maybe the only home he ever owned. So he actually retired here. And not long after he bought his home and got settled into it, he passed away. But some of his belongings are on display at Mulberry Street Methodist Church in Macon. And he was one of the, I think he was a founder of that church. It's been a long time since I read up on it, but anyway, he's got a lot of descendants living because he had a number of children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren on down through the generations. And every once in a while, somebody will come here and visit that's descended from him. And the Masonic Lodge fixed this grave up years ago because he was at one point in his life Grand Chaplain of the state of Georgia.
All right, so it says this monument is erected by order of the most worshipful Grand Lodge of Georgia. I think it's in the memory of their former Grand Chaplain, Reverend Thomas Darley, who departed this life 18th April AD. What is that? 18th April AD 5832. AD 1832. So that's not AD, is it there? That's AL.
I can't tell.
18th April AL, it looks like 5832, AD 1832, in the 63rd year of his age, and who was a shining light to his Masonic brethren to, does that say unite? No, to imitate. That's missing right there. Looks like walls. As a man, Mason, and Christian.
Reverend Darley was a member of a very aristocratic family over in England. The Darley family owned a shipping line, and their ships ran back and forth from England to the United States, or to the colonies, and transported goods back and forth. Well, when the Revolutionary War came on, Reverend Darley was running those ships back and forth. He was a captain on one, and he was captured by the British. He lived here I believe in South Carolina. He was captured by the British, and he was forced into British service. So he served as a British soldier during the war.
Wow.
There was some battle that took place, and he was nearly killed, but he was saved by an American patriot. And due to that, he became a Christian. And he vowed to spend the rest of his life spreading the word of Christ. And so he traveled all over the South as a missionary. And he would help start churches. And his record is very detailed in the Methodist history. You can go through any historical records of the Methodist Church in the South, and you'll find his name in there quite a bit. So he wound up in this part of the wilderness when it was settled, and he came here and helped form this church, and then he retired here. And he formed a lot of churches, including, like I said, Mulberry Street Methodist Church in Macon. And Reverend Darley actually lived down what is now Pierce Road. It turns right here and it went around. The Stone residence is where his house was now, the family of Mr. Buddy Stone, their place. It later became, it was the Neal place later, and then it was the Stone place. But that was the old Darley home place down there, and he owned land all the way up and down what's now known as the Ossahatchee Creek. But that is the oldest marked grave in the cemetery, and he was a Revolutionary soldier, but served the British. Of course, against his wishes, so he said later. That needs to be cut out of there.
Yeah, it does. Tarentine. Mm-hmm. Who are these people?
This is Mr. and Miss Samuel. It was actually Turrentine. It was spelled Turrentine. I believe it's correct on the gate.
Sure is.
And it's also correct on their graves, which you can't see them anymore because the city has allowed this tree to grow up in here. But Mr. and Ms. Turrentine lived right outside of Waverly Hall on a big farm. And there was a crossroads right below their house that for ages it was known as Turrentine Crossroad. And on some old maps you'll still see that it says that. I was actually listening to a weather report one night when we were all scared that we were going to blow away. There was a bad storm coming, and the weather reporter out of the Columbus weather station said that the storm was approaching Turrentine Crossroads just west of Waverly Hall. And everybody says, where in the world is Turrentine Crossroads?
Right.
I said, he had to be looking at an old map.
Yeah.
But I think some of the weather maps still have the old locations like Valley Plains and things like that listed.
And now it's time has turned it into turn time.
Well,
Crossroads,
that's right. Now there's a Turn Time Farms, and there's several other things around here I think that have the name Turn Time on it. And later maps said Turn Time on them as well. But it originally was Turrentine, and this was Mr. Samuel Turrentine and his wife. I believe her name was Mary. They never had any children, and when they died, they left what they had to a nephew. And Mrs. Turrentine's twin sister was the mother of Governor Terrell, who was a former governor of the state of Georgia, or a governor long, long ago. And the Turrentines came here from Meriwether County, and they were very prominent citizens and members of the church here.
So we're still in the bird plot here, and Dan noticed that there's somebody buried right here.
There's a grave right here in this corner. See the hole?
I do.
See a piece of concrete
Yeah.
right here?
And there's an indentation, looks like right there.
One grave or two, but pretty deep hole there. I'm not going to stick my foot all the way down in it because maybe some critter living in there.
Something slithery. But yeah, sure enough. Wonder who that is.
Another mystery.
For sure. It's his mother-in-law is buried here, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think it's fascinating that his mother is not. Of course, you know, we saw her at the Bethesda Cemetery.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that. Somewhere, someone in that family probably has a good photograph of her because she was a McKee, and the McKee families, they were always quite well off. And apparently she stayed pretty close to that side of the family. And she's buried over there with all of them. So I'm sure someone in that family has some photographs.